What the hell is it? Looks like a shopping center. One of those big indoor malls.
Oh, my God.
No chance. Forget it. Let's get out of here.
Wait a minute, they can't get up here.
Yeah, and we can't go down there.
Let's check it out.
Most of the gates are down. I don't think they can get into the stores.
I haven't seen any of them up on the second floor.
The big department stores usually use both floors.
If we can get in up top. It's pretty lit up in there.
Guess the power's not off in this area. A lot of Philly's still lit. Could be nuclear.
What are they doing? Why did they come here?
Some kind of instinct, memory, what they used to do. This was an important place in their lives.
Hey, look at this. This doesn't go down into the mall. What the hell is this? Hey, over here. Storage?
Civil defense. Civil defense water supply.
Boxes of canned food.
Welcome to Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead, Tales from the Final Day, Episode 3 of Season 2. Pedro had just leapt across from a neighboring rooftop, over an alley, through a broken second-story window into this apartment's kitchen. Risking life and limb, he'd risen above the danger of street level and made it into this safe refuge. Pedro avoided thinking about what might have happened if he had fallen short of the gap. A broken leg could be a death sentence in this cruel, cataclysmic world. Neither did he want to think about what might have happened if the zombies, or even feral humans, had pulled him to the ground as he had been fleeing across the open street just minutes before. But all that terror was behind him for now. He could avoid the street level for days. All Pedro wanted now was to hide and take some much-needed rest. He removed his sweat-drenched shirt to look over his aching body using his flashlight. Pedro's fit muscles were peppered in purple and yellow bruises. Some of these welts were from punches, others had been dealt by the zombies' grisly bites. Not deep enough to pierce his skin, but plenty painful enough to hurt and leave their mark on him. His layered paper armor may have saved him from infection, but he was still quite injured. He removed his heavy bags and set them at the foot of his bed, wincing from the pain as he quietly lowered the 80 pounds of supplies to the ground. Pedro longed for a hot shower or a dip in the hot tub like they had at the gym, but he settled for some stretches. In the darkness, he braced his arms against the wall and stretched his calves out. His legs needed to be in good condition. Down on the open street, he had hardly escaped the zombies behind him. Even though he was very fit, he had still barely scraped through. After his workout, Pedro climbed into bed. The night was cold, the electric heating must have forever ended, just like the lights. Pedro pulled a blanket on top of him and tried to fall asleep. But outside in the alley, one of the monsters must have been dragging itself through the bushes. A loud and unsettling brushing sound kept him up. The bed was too near to the window. He stood up, carrying the blanket around himself, and left the room, walking into the apartment's living room where a couch was. It was quieter back here. He lay down on the couch and fell asleep. Pedro awoke to see the light casting through the apartment's galley kitchen, through the window he'd smashed when he first entered last night. It was 8:20 a.m. Wearing the blanket, he moved to the kitchen to scrounge for food. Whoever stocked this fridge wasn't dairy intolerant like Pedro was. Milk, cheese, yogurt, all things which were toxic for him. He checked his bags for food. He only had a large jam jar and a bundle of carrots. He spooned himself a couple dozen spoonfuls of jam. He'd need to find more food today. He couldn't afford to just rest. He drank one of the water bottles he'd brought with him. He still had 3 small water bottles and 1 large. That would be enough to get him through the day. He equipped his armor again. There weren't any other proper shirts here, so he had to put his sweaty tank top back on. Aside from food, a second priority would be finding proper clothes. A jacket or vest would do him wonders. He also had brought a filthy Kevlar vest. If he found enough excess water, he could use some to clean the gore-soaked Kevlar, but he wouldn't put it on while it was filthy. Pedro unloaded his bags onto the shelves in the apartment's living room. The place was fairly easy to get into, and if he ran into trouble, he could lure zombies through the apartment and straight out through the window, leaping onto the other roof. They would fall into the alley, but he could safely jump across. So long as his equipment was fairly light and his legs were still strong. He geared up and tested the jump with all his kit on. He could still make it with ease. He was ready to head out into the apartment building in search of food more nourishing than his carrots and jam. Gripping his homemade cudgel, Pedro was ready to fight off anything he could find on this floor. He opened the apartment's front door and looked out into the hall. Despite the small size of the apartments, the hall itself was quite grand. There looked to be 4 identical apartment doors on this floor. To the side, he could see the stairway up, and separate stairs also led down to ground level. He tried the first adjacent apartment. The door was unlocked, and he went right in. He thought about calling out to see if anybody inside was alive, but chose not to. He'd already decided to believe that he was the only one alive. He'd keep that belief until proven otherwise. It was safer that way. There was no sense pretending or giving into false optimism. The first thing to check was the fridge. To Pedro's delight, an array of healthy food could be found within. Best of all, an entire meat sandwich. He picked the gorgeous sandwich up and had a bite. Instantly, he felt satisfaction spread from his stomach to his entire body. There's nothing quite like a hard-earned meal after practically starving. He wrapped the sandwich up and put it in his tool belt for easy access. He also grabbed the other delectable foods: an apple, an orange, an onion, and raspberries. There were also 3 small boxes of oatmeal, 2 bottles of honey, and a tin of salmon. Whoever had lived here had left Pedro a mighty bounty of the sort of health-conscious foods he loved. Pedro continued to gather from the apartment, also taking 6 bags of black tea, the books Ham Radio Illustrated and CQB Monthly. He also took a game, Battle Hammer 20K. If he was having a bad day, maybe this could cheer him up. But for now, he had no time for idleness. He went on to the next apartment, finding 2 strips of bacon in the fridge, as well as work gloves and a balaclava. He also found heartburn medicine and cotton balls in the bathroom. The final apartment on this floor was locked. He'd need to break it down, but so far Pedro had scavenged in silence. He wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. Later, he would come back to this one. He'd found enough food to last him a few days, but Pedro was curious about the stairs that led up. There had been no zombies on this floor. Maybe there wouldn't be any up there either. It seemed awfully quiet. He unloaded his bag back in the original apartment. Then it was time to go upstairs. He climbed up and found himself in a small room. Opening the door revealed that he was now up on the apartment's rooftop. 8 cooling units and other miscellaneous rooftop appliances were here. These could yield some useful materials if he decided to take them apart. But most interesting of all was what he could see in the far distance. His added visible range from the height here on the rooftop revealed a garage, far off on the highway exiting town to the east. He couldn't see any further, but it seemed to be out away from the city. The idea of reaching a garage with all its mechanical tools designed to work on vehicles was beyond exciting for Pedro. With a proper car, he could take off from the city and search for better food. Since this apartment building only seemed to be rather short at 2 floors, he'd need to leave the apartment within a few days. Seeing the garage gave him a mission. He could take a day or 2 here to clean the water from the apartment's toilet tanks, refilling any bottles of unhealthy soda that were here. Then he could make his trip to the garage, traveling straight through the forest under cover of night. For now, it made sense to take it easy. If he waited at least a day, his legs would be in better shape. Pedro went back down to the 2nd floor apartments. He took 5 bottles of energy cola and dumped the sugary sludge down the drain. He filled the bottles instead with water from a toilet, then started a fire in an apartment stove and boiled the water in a copper pot to ensure it was clean. Soon he had 5 more clean water bottles. There were some gallon jugs as well. He took one of the milk jugs, poured that out, then filled it with clean boiled water. Pedro had an excess of water now. It was time to clean that Kevlar armor he'd taken from a SWAT zombie back in the house where he had begun his cataclysm. He pulled out his Kevlar armor, picked up his washboard from the shelves, grabbed a bottle of detergent, and filled 2 gallon jugs of dirty water. But he needed just a little bit more water before he could do it. He'd need to break into the last apartment on this floor rather than use his clean water supply. He crafted a makeshift crowbar using a pipe, but it proved not to be strong enough to open the door on its own. It was time for brute force. He smashed the crowbar against the doorknob and immediately a burglar alarm went off. This alarm must have been battery-powered and separate from the city's power grid. More than anything, the sound frustrated Pedro and made him smash the door with renewed strength. The door splintered, and Pedro followed it in as the splinters fell off the hinges. He went directly to the bathroom and began to clean his Kevlar vest. Minutes later, the vest was cleaned of its past wearer's gore. He dipped the damp and sudsy vest on. This would improve his defense greatly. With the remainder of the unused water, Pedro boiled it. He now had 2 gallons plus 7 small bottles and 1 large bottle, all of clean water. Assuming he drank 2 bottles a day, he could last for 11 days on this. That's nearly halfway to a month, assuming none of this is used in cooking. He sat down on the apartment's couch and took a few more bites of the sandwich. It was 12:35 p.m. now, just past noon. He wrapped up the last part of the sandwich for dinner later. Pedro had some time. If he read his books now, he wouldn't have to carry them all around with him later. He started with a book called CQB Monthly. Just as he was about to sit down, he noticed an iBot in the far distance. An iBot was a low-altitude surveillance drone, usually deployed by police or military. He opened the curtains wide enough that he could watch it as it swayed in the wind. It seemed to be idling, and Pedro wondered if it was watching him. He left the window open and sat down at a desk to read, still in view of the iBot. Something about it made him feel not so alone. He knew deep down inside that the thing was probably following an autonomous protocol, its operators just as dead as everybody else. But to see something moving, even something mechanical, that wasn't trying to kill him, brought him a feeling of peace. CQB Monthly was a really basic book and had nothing for Pedro to learn. He'd boxed before and knew the basics of fighting. You let the other guy miss or let him try a bad hit, then come in with a more solid blow of your own before he can right himself. Fool your opponent into taking bad shots and make sure yours are good. He tossed the beginner's book aside. He took a book called All About Swords and read through that instead. His specialty was bashing weapons, but it was worth a browse. While he read about cutting weapons, the eyebot drifted closer, then suddenly out of view. He stood up near the window, but couldn't see it anymore. It must have carried on elsewhere. He shelved the finished book, then pulled out another. Ham Radio Illustrated covered basic electronics, which Pedro was not at all familiar with. He read through the book. This one would come with him, because it had many useful recipes, especially the ones for a hot plate and light vehicle alternators. With the know-how to make a bicycle alternator, he could convert a bike to work with an engine. Around 5 p.m. he heard some movement downstairs and took a break from reading. He consumed the last 2 bites of his meat sandwich. It was such delicious food, and he lamented the fact that it may be his final bites of cooked fresh meat for a long time. It would likely be canned meat from here on out. The noise vanished, so he went back to reading, but after a few minutes, there it was again. He wanted to ignore the sound. After all, what was he going to do? Go downstairs and fight the thing? Screw that. He didn't want to risk it yet. With the book on beginner's electronics done, he went into the kitchen. Pedro was really hungry. His fast metabolism meant he'd constantly need to find more food. He ate the can of salmon with some raspberries and washed that down with water. He went into the east-facing apartments and opened the window. There was another neighboring house that looked just far enough to jump across the alley and onto the roof. The house seemed to have a single downspout in the alley between the 2 buildings, which he could use to get back up when returning from the east. Pedro thought the plan over in his mind. On a clear night, he would travel east, climbing down the rooftop and heading through the forest, straight to the garage beyond. Within it, he hoped to find a working vehicle. But if he could find a vehicle even closer, that would make all this easier. He stepped out onto the east house's roof to try and get a good look at the street. There was a vehicle with what looked like a deer prow on it, useful for when you're off-roading and don't want to be unlifed by a skittish deer. That could be very useful if the vehicle was in working condition. Better yet, he might even be able to scout out the vehicle's condition from his apartment's building entrance. That he could even do today before the sun set. It was time to take a little risk. He'd go downstairs and scope out the vehicle on the street in front of the apartment building's front entrance. Pedro cautiously stepped downstairs. The central hall down here was equally big as the one above it. He was still in the shade and would not yet be seen by anything nearby. Looking at the car, its 2 front tires were busted. That was bad news. It meant he'd need to jack the car up to change them. He didn't have a jack, but the garage would probably have one. He moved closer to see the rear 2 tires were busted as well. Although there was an intact rear tire attached to the back, he'd still need 3 new tires for the thing. The gas tank was in perfect condition, but the battery was really bad and draining itself of energy. The engine was in poor shape too. All in all, this was not the vehicle he needed right now. It'd be more useful to take the prow off and attach it to a working vehicle instead, but that was a job for much later. Pedro decided that since he was down here and it was relatively clear, he should try and search any of the apartments that he could easily enter. So long as he kept to the shadows, he could do it safely. If anything went wrong, he'd rush back to the stairs to stay in control. He went into the east room first, since that faced away from the city. In the fridge, he found another small fortune, some fruits, a salad, and 2 India Pale Ales, some soy sauce, and even a few pickled meats and veggies. In the far distance, out the windows to the north, he could see 2 SWAT zombies. He'd killed 1 SWAT zombie before, and despite its difficulty, it also yielded a chance of having guns or grenades, in addition to its armor. He took a mental note of it for now. He unloaded his harvest from the first of the ground floor apartments, as well as the bounty of food. He'd found a small bottle of antibiotics, which would help him if he contracted an infection. As a note, that's a huge finding. My first character this season died because they couldn't find any antibiotics in their entire neighborhood. To find antibiotics in this second building is a sign that the random number gods favor Pedro. He'd also taken a fresh and well-fitting pair of boxers and new pants. He changed into them. The sun was starting to set. Pedro wanted to check the other ground floor apartments before the light was completely gone. He opened the fridge in the west ground floor apartment and nearly cried when he saw a package of rotten New York wieners. These fallen soldiers had been one of Pedro's favorites, being hot dogs smothered in ground meat and chopped onions. For Pedro, this was about as close to junk food as he would eat. He closed the fridge like a tomb. Rest in peace, New York wieners. He opened a bedroom and saw a decayed zombie meandering outside an open window. Carefully he stepped forward, ensuring it noticed him. If he could bring it in without it breaking any glass, he would be able to easily put it down and pulp it. It drew nearer, and he swung a first strike too soon, missing it. Then a second strike put it down immediately. He splattered it across the floor, ensuring that it would never get back up. He snuck past the window and took a checkers set from the shelf. After looting the bathroom, Pedro headed into a fully lit bedroom. Outside, he was spotted by a zombie that seemed to be barely clinging to life, and beyond it lay a bunch of pits. Most of these pits were shallow, but some were so deep that he couldn't see the bottom from where he stood. It seemed to be a house that had just begun construction, as the foundation was being dug out. By the looks of it, zombies had been falling into the pits, hurting themselves such that they were unable to stand. Many had grown so weak they had collapsed, and all Pedro would need to do was walk over and pulp them easily. But the mass of twitching corpses writhing in the dirt was unsettling. At the edge of one of the pits, to Pedro's uncanny gaze, lay a Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver, the first gun Pedro had seen since the Cataclysm began. He couldn't tell from this distance whether the gun had any ammo, but the pits seemed an incredible blessing on their own. This terrain feature was seemingly capable of disabling zombies. He weighed whether or not to go to the pits in a couple hours after night fell, or right now. He decided that the last rays of light would actually be in his favor. If he could lure more zombies into the pits, he could easily dispatch them. And it looked like so many of the nearby zombies had already fallen in that it was surprisingly sparse of standing zombies in the area. But there was still one zombie between him and the pits that had already met his gaze. He needed to take it down first. One zombie could be easily managed. He beat it down with a few quick strikes from his cudgel. He made a quick plan. He'd walk over to the SWAT zombies and lure them into the pits. Then he would catch them as they stumbled and beat them with his cudgel as they struggled to climb out. In the pits, he could see dozens of still twitching corpses. Pedro knew that he'd need to pulp these bodies as soon as possible, as the ditches filled with corpses represented a mass of zombies that would soon rise again. If they rose, sure, they may fall right back in, but there was a chance they would escape, and the sooner he put them to eternal death, the better. But first, Pedro lured the closest of two SWAT zombies towards the pits. Predictably, the zombie in its cumbersome armor fell down into a shallow trench. Pedro rushed in, beating its armored head with his chair-leg cudgel. As he swung over and over again from above, the zombie managed to grasp his club, and with its other hand clawed Pedro in the torso, right below his Kevlar armor. He was bleeding from the gouge, but it wasn't too bad. He pushed away with all his strength, breaking out of the monster's grasp. He rushed around the pits to regain control of the situation, repositioning opposite a hole. The zombie fell in, and he rushed in to beat it. Again, it managed to catch his club and slashed clear through his paper leg guards. Whatever training this SWAT zombie had received while living, it had seemingly retained a fraction of that through death. The SWAT zombie crawled out of the pit that would have been its grave, more due to inertia than good footing. But Pedro had so many pits to choose from, and he led it back to yet another. A second zombie was rounding the corner of this half-built home. Pedro kept beating on the SWAT zombie's now cratering helmet. Then the thing fell limp and slid back down. Before fighting the oncoming zombie, Pedro greedily looked over the SWAT zombie's corpse for any special weapons. Nothing but gore-soaked armor. He waited, catching a few breaths as the oncoming zombie fell into the very same pit. He attacked. A miss, 5 hits, and it was dead, its body sliding down the pit and resting on top of the others. Pedro wasted no more time. He would pulp the zombies now, so that none would ever rise again. A few other straggling zombies wandered in while he did his grisly work, and Pedro strategically used the pits to stun and slow the zombies. These traps gave him a great advantage over the brain-dead shamblers. He could only be in awe at the ability of dirt, or lack of dirt, to annihilate and disable so many of the undead. He went back to grab his bag so that he could loot the bodies, as he heard a window shatter. Another zombie was out in the alley here, and he simply led it to the pits. 7 hits and it was dead. At this pace, tomorrow he could spend as much of the day as possible luring zombies into the pits and destroying them. Now to pulp the rest and loot them all. He found a talking doll and removed its batteries. He opened a wallet and took its contents out, some bills and a Food Place loyalty card. But then he slipped and fell into a pit, ripping his boxer shorts, but mostly just bruising his ass. His fall was cushioned by the corpses, and something snapped and gave way to his weight. He climbed back out of the pit. He picked up the Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver. It had 5 bullets left. Not many, but it could do in a pinch. For instance, if he ran into those feral humans again, he would shoot them rather than take the fight head-to-head. 2 more zombies wandered near, and he took them down in the pits the same way as the others. The second one even died instantly as it fell into its own shallow grave. With all the zombies here dead, the sun was fading fast. Pedro intended to kill that second SWAT zombie before it was too dark to see. He lured the thing towards the pit, sprinting to stay just ahead. He was more exhausted than he was comfortable with. 13 strikes, and it was dead. No weapons on this one either. It had some nice combat boots, but Pedro thought they would be too heavy. He didn't have enough extra water to clean any more clothing yet. As the last bit of light faded on this second day of the Cataclysm, Pedro walked back to his nearby apartment. Discovering these pits was a huge revelation. He could probably clear the nearby houses tomorrow, leading their denizens into the pits and easily offing them. He unloaded the food he'd scavenged from downstairs. There were still 2 apartments in this same building for him to loot tomorrow too. He removed his heavy and bloody gear, wrapping his naked body in a soft blanket. He slept very easy tonight. With the nearby zombies all dead, there were no noises outside to wake him. But that is enough for this episode of Cataclysm: Dark Days Ahead, Tales from the Final Day. This second day went far better than I expected. I didn't know how tall this apartment building would be, but it turned out to be just 2 floors. The pits near it, however, are incredibly lucky. Having an easy way to kill zombies, or rather, a way to efficiently leverage time and stamina into causing more deaths, is so powerful. These pits are like a field of traps, which Pedro can navigate to easily dispatch regular zombies. Since I play with 8 times evolution speed, I'm gonna try and use the pits as much as possible this first week. The more zombies dead sooner, the fewer will evolve in my neighborhood. Who knows, we may be on track to explore an even wider area than I did last season with Foster. Although he doesn't have much food yet, Pedro now has the means to extend his survival. but the usefulness of the pit may have a limited range. I don't know how far I can lure zombies from before Pedro gets too exhausted from the running to fight them off once he's here. If I can get a vehicle, especially a bike, I'll be laughing all the way to the end of the month. A bike would be prime for so many reasons. Pedro will be keeping an eye out for one. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I've been practicing making my editing tighter, since that is what has taken the most time for me to make these episodes in the past. Ideally, I'll get to a point where I can rapidly punch out these episodes whenever I want. That means relying more on in-game footage and fewer stock footage shots. But I'll still try and use a good amount of zombie movie footage, since I really like to do that. I finished reading David Moody's Autumn the City. I'm gonna recommend it here again because I really loved it. I'll probably be ordering another David Moody novel soon. Probably the next from the same series. I also want to recommend another piece of zombie content. Way back, maybe 12 years ago when I was a teen, I found an immersive zombie blog. There's something so terrifyingly relatable about the concept of using a live journal blog to record a personal story of a zombie apocalypse. Imagine a world where, instead of being able to reach out for help and cooperation during an apocalypse, you can only record what is happening to you alone. There is nobody out there to help. In Alpha Dog's case, it is because society has disintegrated so much that he doesn't trust to reveal his location. He hides away and he survives, but at what cost to his sanity? I think reading Alpha Dog gave me an appreciation for realism in zombie stories. Alpha Dog does realism to such a high degree as an immersive blog that the most chilling part of the experience is in having to remind yourself that it isn't actually real, especially if you've been reading it for hours and it's now 2 a.m. I love his extreme attention to detail and the variety of writing. Sometimes you get a day where he's made an expedition outside to a neighboring house where he recounts the grisly details of what happened to the neighbors. Other times, you'll get him having a day where, in his paranoia, he's making himself more secure than necessary. And sometimes, you'll get some strange poetry which begins to convince you he has lost his mind. There is something so frightfully interesting about Alpha Dog's 6-year-long story. It follows a young man and his dog as they try to survive in their own home neighborhood. It's one of the most impressive examples of immersive zombie content I've come across, and it's influenced me to a huge degree. If you want to find a story so terrifying that you'll want to stay up all night reading it, head on over to Alpha Dog's Slow Motion Apocalypse. The best way to navigate the site is by using the calendar. Open a new tab for the day you want to read, and then come back to the calendar when you're done. The beauty of this is you can choose to read from the very beginning or just read from different parts of the story as you want. There's something special about horror novels in that compared to horror movies, a novel is more terrifying because it allows your own fears and imagination to fill the gaps. I know when I read these stories, I find my own mind filling in aspects of Alpha Dog's story that stem from my personal fears. The way that each person interprets a story like this is different. One of the best things about Alpha Dog is that it is written from a common person's perspective, in a blog-like writing style. It doesn't often go into extreme literary detail to add description, but when it does, it paints a frightful picture that stands out. That's a feature that I think Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead does equally well. As a roguelike with minimal graphics, it lets you fill in the horrific details yourself and imagine a story that is much deeper and more personal than a storyteller could ever come up with on their own. It's so engaging in that it leaves half of the storytelling up to you. And with that, I will say, take care, be well, and I look forward to the next episode of Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead, Tales from the Final Day, where we will see whether Pedro hunger wins, good fortune continues, or whether his fortune turns to famine.